Good. Well, it's good to be here. It's good to be with you all today. I'm a firm believer that our most valuable asset is our time. So thank you of giving your most valuable asset to be here today. My name is Major Lisa Barnes. No, that's not accurate. My name is not Major. That is my rank with the Salvation Army, which means I've served for 15 years in an officer capacity role. My current appointment with the Salvation Army is the Divisional Secretary over Los Angeles. What that means is we have 13 programs that fall under that umbrella. The first is Alegria. That's a permanent supportive housing as well as transitional units for our friends and neighbors with HIV and AIDS. We have Bell Shelter in the city of Bell that has 500 bed capacity and a farm. So as someone who's kind of hippy-dippy, I love that we have a farm. We have Hope Harbor that has 56 beds for men. Many of those are veterans and those in recovery. We have Lafayette, which is a pretty neat facility. It's built out of shipping containers in the Pico Union neighborhood. We have Lily's Place, which is a home for 10 families, also connected to Zahn, which is a transitional living for 20 families. We have the Way Inn on Hollywood Boulevard, which is really close to my heart. It serves 18 to 24-year-old transitional aged youth. The vast majority have been in foster care at some point in their life, as well as scattered sites across different parts of Los Angeles. We have the Watts Bridge Home that has 100 spaces there, 70 men, 30 women. Westwood Transitional Village that has 40 units, 18 of those are veterans. If you can't tell, I have a soft spot in my heart for our veterans receiving services after giving so much. We have Salvation Village, which is a tiny home village, 72 tiny pallet homes in right across from Harbor City Junior College. One of my favorite jokes, I had a friend coming to LA. She says, I can't find any place to live. I said, you know, I run one of the most exclusive gated communities in Southern California. We have the Red Shield, which is the Pico Union neighborhood. It's a youth community center. We also have the Siemens Center on South Central Boulevard. Connected to Siemens Center is a mobile outreach, which is a truck, a van that's fully outfitted to serve our friends and neighbors on Skid Row and connecting with services there. So today when we talk about what the Salvation Army does, specifically in LA Metro, the magic we talk about happens from those 13 programs and facilities. That'll be our point of reference. Now, I personally count it an extreme privilege to serve in this way, to participate in miracles every single day, because I know without any shadow of any doubt that the work that the Salvation Army does changes lives forever, because it changed mine. My birth mother was an addict and a prostitute. I was also the product of an affair, and I have lived experience. I have lived experience when I was a child, when I received respite in sheltering facilities. When we had no food, the Salvation Army dropped a food box to my house and invited me to youth group. That food box was so much more than just a food box. That food box changed my entire life. I went to youth group. I was afraid that they would know who my mom was or where we lived or the things that she did and if that would affect their care for me. And they did find out, and it did not affect their care for me. They were the first people to say, maybe, Lisa, you could go to college. What? What do you mean? My story doesn't have to be my mom's story. So I say all of this to you this morning so that as we start our day, as we start these really important conversations, that you would remember that every life that is impacted by the work we get to do, every statistic that we count is not just a number, it's Lisa. It's generational change, and all of it matters. Before we go much further, I would like to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Mike Dickinson. He's the Divisional Commander of Southern California. Colonel Mike, if you would stand for us. He's also my boss, so you can go ahead and give surveys about how wonderful this day was directly to him sometime during the day.
All right.
A couple housekeeping things to keep in mind before you leave. Often when people leave these events, they get like a swag bag. Maybe it has some stress balls or a notepad. I don't really got time for that. I don't think most people really care about that, but I want you to leave with something. So I have these kits you're all going to take with you when you leave. On the front it says, I am a Hope Ambassador. Because we have this day, you get fired up about the work that's happening, and the first question that most people have is, but what do I do next? And here's your answer. You're going to take one of these kits, and then inside are 3 different bags. So when you see our friends and neighbors experiencing homelessness, that you see them, maybe they're asking for some spare change, and you think, I don't know if that's the best idea, but what can I do? This is what you can do. These have small hygiene kits. They have antibacterial wipes, a non-perishable snack, a small bottle of water, a pair of socks, and then the most important aspect is, how do I get help? There's information on there for who do they call, how do they get help, how do they leave the streets. So I'm going to thank you in advance for being a Hope Ambassador today. If you need to use the restroom, so right outside this door along this partition, please feel free to do that whenever you want. We'll have breaks, but you're grown. Drinks are back there. Also get those whenever you want, because you're still grown. And you came down the steps from the elevator to leave. You don't have to do that. There's another elevator on this floor. You can jet out that way whenever you have to. Great. Well, I would love to introduce Andrew Jameson. He's a lawyer. He's a producer. He is my board chair for LA Metro Advisory Board. And if you want someone in your life who makes things happen, he's the guy you want on your team. Let's welcome Andrew Jameson.
Thank you, Major Lisa. Good morning. Good morning. On behalf of the Los Angeles Metro Advisory Board, I just want to welcome you to the 2024 Homelessness Symposium. Special thanks go out to the Salvation Army leadership, to my fellow board members, to our speakers and our panelists here today, and to our sponsors, especially our lead sponsor, Gibson Dunn. So a wise man once said, simply spending a fortune on something doesn't automatically make it a success. And we see a lot of this in our daily lives. For those of you who are Dodger fans, you'll see that every October they remind us that spending a lot of money on something doesn't automatically make it successful. We'll see what happens this October. And unfortunately, this axiom also seems to apply to a more serious problem, which is homelessness. Billions of dollars have been spent in Los Angeles alone, and yet we don't necessarily see much closer to a solution. There are still Angelinos on the street, and they are hurting more than ever. And it's at moments like these where I think it's important for us to assess what's working, what's not working, and what needs to be done. And as the Salvation Army is helping lead the charge against homelessness, housing over 9,000 people in California every night alone, it seemed only fitting that they host today's forum. So hopefully today we can find kernels of solutions and conversations about the Grants Pass case, about the need for NPOs to collaborate, and the importance of new strategies and fresh ideas. In showcasing leading voices from the public and private sectors, I'm hopeful we can take one more step towards building awareness, confronting hard truths, stimulating change, and finding answers. And speaking of leading voices in the public sector, it's my great honor to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. She is a graduate of Dartmouth College. She earned her MBA from UC Berkeley. She worked for almost 20 years at AKT Development, a leading housing firm in the Sacramento area. From 2010 to 2013, she served as our ambassador to Hungary under President Barack Obama. And in 2019, she was sworn in as the Lieutenant Governor of the state of California. It is my great pleasure and honor to call her a friend. It is my great pleasure and honor to have her here today. So please join me in welcoming the 50th Lieutenant Governor of the state of California, Elena Kounalakis.
So much, Andrew. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you, Gibson Dunn, for that remarkable coffee machine, and for having us here and hosting this incredibly important discussion. And of course, thank you to the Salvation Army, to Major Barnes, is that right? And Colonel Dickinson. Thank you for everything you're doing, not just here in Los Angeles, but across the state, in the 133 countries where you're present and serve over 160 years. The Salvation Army has cared about people and just done remarkable things. I'd also like to recognize DNA Evangelists. I'm going to talk a little bit toward the end about grants past, but DNA, thank you for having us here in your law firm, and it's just such a pleasure to see you, and thank you for all that you've been doing. Along with, by the way, I think Wendy Brule is coming a little bit later just to acknowledge her incredible leadership here in LA. Major Barnes, you started with a personal story, so I thought maybe I would share mine. I'm the daughter of an immigrant who came to the United States when he was 15. He moved into a plywood garage in the Central Valley with his bachelor uncle. He went to school, he worked as a farm worker, and eventually, under the encouragement of some people in the neighborhood, he went to college. So he moved to Sacramento. He enrolled at Sacramento State University, and he worked his way through as a waiter in the governor's mansion. So when I think about the trajectory of my family, whether it's the fact that my grandmother never learned to read or write, my father had this incredible opportunity to come to the United States, work hard, and build a business, or my husband's family, his parents, also like my father, both refugees to the United States. His father started out as a Greyhound bus mechanic and a cab driver, and ended up working his career as a truck driver. And at that time, these kinds of working class jobs allowed families like my husband to put a roof over the family's head and food on the table and tell their kids you can be anything you want and have that be true. We're really challenged in California today with the cost of living. We're challenged in the country, but particularly in California. And the homeless crisis is without question a byproduct of the affordability crisis and the housing crisis. But I want to start just because you have a whole day digging into the details of the challenges presented by homelessness, particularly here in Los Angeles County. But I want to just give you a little bit of a sense of the profile of what's happening statewide and what the state is attempting to do to address these challenges. We're talking a lot about everything that we're doing, but the reality is that the point-in-time numbers in California for homeless people, unhoused people on the streets have actually grown since the pre-pandemic levels. Approximately 130,000 people were registered as homeless in the point-in-time numbers in 2018, and today they have risen to 186,000. So I'm going to talk about all the things that we're doing. You're going to hear about all of this, but the reality is it's some combination of not enough and perhaps not as effective as we need to be with our resources. I was listening today as I was coming in, there's some data coming out about the delivery of affordable housing with wraparound services and some of the challenges in bringing that online. The fact, she said something really great. She said there's this combination of urgency where people are moving very quickly to deliver resources, but then also the challenges of accountability that's associated with the urgency of the response. But in terms of what that response looks like, the governor's office is using a number now of the financial allocations toward combating and dealing with homelessness in our state. The number he is using is $27 billion. Considering before this administration, the state barely registered when it came to engagement. It was up to the counties and the cities. This is just a massive number. Now, embedded within that are elements like federal support and the Project Home Key and before that, Project Room Key have been a big part of it. Project Home Key alone has been funded to the tune of $3.3 billion, again, just in the last couple of years. And there has been another about $5 billion allocated by the state through the Homelessness Housing Assistance Program, again, for delivering beds, but also the much needed wraparound services, because as we know, the addiction issues and the mental health issues are such a big part of the challenge. Project Home Key is now credited with delivering statewide about 15,000 housing units. Again, remarkable number, over 15,000 housing units. And largely these are much better than the kinds of things that we did when I was on the Port Commission in San Francisco, where we took big old warehouse piers and filled them with beds and facilities. The Project Home Key is, motels, hotels, other kinds of much more humane, I think, and long-term, the potential for long-term type housing. So 15,000 units is a big number. But again, when you compare that to the overall challenge of 186,000 unhoused, you can see why we are really only just beginning to meet the challenge, even though the numbers associated with delivering all of this are just staggering and unprecedented. So that's kind of the first bucket is the money and where the money is going for more units and wraparound services. The second thing that the state is doing that I'm sure you have heard of, but I think is important to recognize, is the issue of care courts and conservancy. This has been a giant leap forward. I think it was Scott Wiener who said it best a couple of years ago in the battle over conservatorship, which, as you know, is not favored by a lot of the advocacy groups. This idea that people would have their free will compromised once they're 18 years old. But Scott Wiener put it this way. He said, we already have conservatorship in California. It's called jail. So the costs associated with that, and of course the inappropriate place to put people who are sick and homeless, that has been a big part of the argument to expand conservatorship, which we have done. Again, a lot of this is still baby steps, but it has addressed a real need. I have a friend, she's a mom, her child, it's just absolutely tragic, started using drugs, had major mental health issues with schizophrenia, and she's a lawyer, but her son is over 18 years old. And so as she begged the courts and begged the jail where he was being held to be able to have access, he did not want his mother to be part of his life. Again, a function of his illness, I think. I have to believe, because I know her as just a wonderful person. This is just a tragedy. And what we know is that there are, in so many cases, family members who love the person who is struggling and want to be there to provide assistance. But if they are barred from that, we are missing out on a very important piece of what we can bring to the table to help these folks who are suffering at the scale of the suffering that we are seeing. Care court is another piece of it. Now, it was much more ambitious at the start. Again, as these things often make their way through the legislature, somewhat scaled down. It is being piloted in several counties, including here in Los Angeles. And I think it's safe to say it's off to a slow start. But I'm very optimistic about the potential for the future of care courts to help navigate people into care, to help bring family members on board to support these efforts. And over time, if we can see the success of cases coming through care court, I'm very hopeful to see that could be expanded. And then, I will say this, one of the things that we found through, again, my personal experience when I was on the Port Commission in San Francisco is that there are very often ways to help people navigate their way back to family. So not just in the extreme cases where people are ending up in jail, you know, but just in the kind of family dynamics that can lead to a person feeling that their only hope is to run away. And you know, one of the stories you hear down in Los Angeles, and again, something that would be unheard of in Northern California, quite frankly, is this draw of Hollywood and this dream that you could come here and maybe make it in Hollywood and then find yourself out on the streets. Very often there is family somewhere that if you can, as we did in the ports, create these navigation centers where people are able to get immediate care, but then be put back in touch with family. It is remarkable how many of those cases can result in people navigating their way back to family. One of the headlines I saw recently come over my feed was California is busing homeless back to Texas and Florida. You might have seen that, you know, a real a distortion. But if there are people who have family in other parts of the country and who, in being put back in touch with them, are able to find their way back, this is a really important tool to take pressure off the system as a whole, but also just the humane approach. Finally, I'll just recognize the governor's the power of the ballot box and Proposition 1. I don't discard the notion that there may be more to come through the ballot box because people are so deeply concerned and engaged on this issue, and because we are looking at a challenge that is going to be with us for a while. So Proposition 1 was, I think, a really smart thing to do. It included major changes to the Mental Health Services Act, which was already collecting the millionaire tax money, and that money was not in the view of the governor and many of his advisors, and I think that they made a good case for this. It was not being used in the most efficient and effective way. So not just expanding and changing what those funds could be used for, but bonding against them to raise additional funds. Proposition 1 passed by a whisker. I think largely that was because of this notion that people thought that it was going to result in, by floating bonds, and additional revenue needing to be raised to service the debt as opposed to what it was, which was a reallocation. And so fortunately it did pass, and I think that is important, not just because we have to remember that as we approach the future of this challenge, people at the ballot box is something that shouldn't be discounted, but also the fact that it will bring more resources. But I would go back to the beginning of what I said and what Major you articulated as well. Or I'm sorry, it was Andrew articulated, but I think you got it as well, which is your Dodgers example. Does more money, right, does lots of money solve the problem? You know, going back to my own family story, my father started a business in housing. I worked with him for 18 years. In my time as lieutenant governor, and this is the first elected position I've ever held, what I see all the time is this idea that problem plus money equals solution. That is just not the case. It is problem plus solution plus money equals solution. And very, very often we are hearing this rhetoric of people, Californians saying, what is government doing? What is government doing? And the answer from elected officials is this billion, that billion, this billion. And it is not enough. And we are starting to see that come home to roost. So it is good to have money in this system. It is great that we had 2 years of massive budget surpluses in California to be able to fund a lot of this. We are now in deficit years. So we have to get smarter with how we use our dollars. So finally, I want to talk about grants passed, because this is just a remarkable thing. And DNA being here, I mean, and again, being in your law firm, for those of you who don't know what a remarkable thing this is, and you're going to tell your story this afternoon, so I won't tell it all for you, but we've been friends for a long time. It was her work on one of the advisory boards here in LA that brought her into the Boise decision 6, 7 years ago, which took away the ability of municipalities to enforce their no camping laws and other laws related to it if the jurisdiction can't prove in a court that there is enough housing for everybody under the definition of what the court thinks would be adequate. Very, very high bar, and very few municipalities, particularly in California, particularly in the cities that have the biggest challenges, were able to meet that test. And therefore, suddenly you found cities and county cities in particular unable to clear encampments. I think you called it, DNA, a failed experiment. And it certainly was. And the challenges were terrible, because what we know is that these large encampments were not just, frankly, unacceptable to residents and people who live and work in these communities. In a place, by the way, a state that is known for compassion and care, because so many of us have walked a journey that could have ended up, very much the way that folks living on the street are experiencing. But most importantly, the people living in these encampments were not being best served. They're dangerous. They are hubs for all kinds of drugs and proliferation of dangerous drugs, fentanyl, just a terrible situation. So I wish I were going to be here. I've got another speaking thing, because I never get tired of listening to DNA talk about this. And on the way in, I asked her about some of the things that have happened since and the results of that decision. But thank you for taking it on, because she, and I was very happy to participate in helping this along, managed to get Governor Newsom to file an amicus brief on the side of the cities against the ACLU. The politics were completely not aligned the way anyone would imagine over this issue, because the experience in California was so dire. I was there, by the way. Tony Kennedy, Justice Kennedy, is from Sacramento, so he's an old friend of our family. I called and asked for a ticket, and I went to watch her argue this case, and it really was a remarkable thing. Okay, so I'm going to leave you on one final comment. That's about housing. For a long time, people were arguing that homelessness had nothing to do with the housing crisis in California. Finally, people are recognizing, in fact, that it has everything to do with that. Berkeley has now come out with a very clear study that you cannot tackle homelessness if you do not have a place for people to go. You cannot help get people on the road to recovery from drug addiction or get them the support for their mental health crisis if you do not have a safe place for people to go. So As someone who spent 18 years building master planned communities in the Sacramento region, let me just say that we have a long way to go when it comes to delivering the housing we need. Governor Newsom came into office with a pledge to deliver 3 million more housing units. I told him when we were both running, look, I know what that looks like. At our height, when I was in the industry, we delivered right up at about 200,000 units in a year, 200,000 units in 1 year at the height. To try to get to 3 million, you're already looking at a challenge, but after the Great Recession, it dropped to about 80,000. And it's only hovered about 100,000 units a year since. We used to say that the no-growth movement was throwing sand in the wheels, in the gears of the housing production industry. And there are definitely efforts to slash through red tape to be able to deliver housing, but this is going to be a real challenge going forward. And I think it's going to take bringing the people to the table who know how to build housing, not just affordable housing, because a lot of the affordable housing experts, they can operate in an environment where it's $700, $800, $1 million a door to deliver that housing. What we have to look at is market rate affordable housing. Housing that is affordable to middle-class families without massive subsidies. It is the only way forward. And I flew down here very early this morning. This is my 4th trip down to LA in 14 days, I think. And I always look out the window. I look out the window to marvel at what a remarkably beautiful state we are living in. But I also look out the window and I contemplate where we can grow in a way that's welcomed by communities that want economic development, to take pressure off of what is clearly the greatest challenge we have in the state, which is the housing crisis. It is driving the affordability crisis for working families, and it is making this challenge of dealing with the homeless 186,000 unhoused people intractable until we are able to bring on more housing. I was going to leave you with that, but I want to just say one other thing. Back when I was serving as a U.S. ambassador, actually even before that, when I was doing work in international engagement, I was in Jordan visiting Palestinian refugee camps. I've spent a lot of time in refugee camps in Jordan, in Greece, in Albania, in Afghanistan. There are approaches to dealing, and I think that the Salvation Army probably knows this very well from your international work, in dealing with real crises of the unhoused. We need to be thinking about this crisis on the mass scale that it is, and bringing those kinds of lessons that we've learned from refugee crises to bear, and think a little bit more out of the box. But anyway, I could go on. I'm not going to, other than just to say again what a pleasure it is to be here with all of you. What an honor, and I hope that this is a very fruitful day talking about this challenge and finding some more solutions. Thank you.